Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I've always liked being alone in the woods. Out there, the world goes quiet. The only sounds are the wind pushing through the trees, the crackle of a campfire, and the occasional rustling of some harmless creature moving through the underbrush. That silence, real silence, is something you don't get in the city. No cars, no sirens, no people. Just you and nature. That's why I went out to the Black Hills last summer. A weekend of solitude. No phone, no emails. Just me, my tent, and the sound of the stream running beside my campsite. The first night was perfect. I made a fire, cooked some food, and stretched out on my sleeping bag, staring at the sky through the mesh of my tent. The stars out there were incredible, so clear, so sharp. I fell asleep feeling completely at peace. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not a deer, not a bear, not the light scurrying of some small animal. These were heavy steps, deliberate, crunching through the leaves. I sat up, my heart immediately hammering. I'd camped enough to know the sounds of the forest, and this wasn't normal. It was walking like a person, but there was something off about it. The timing was wrong, like whoever or whatever it was hadn't quite figured out how human legs were supposed to move. I swallowed hard and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers unsteady as I flicked it on and aimed it at the trees. At first, I saw nothing but branches shifting in the night breeze. But then, there, something just at the edge of the firelight. And it was me. Same build, same clothes, same posture. But the face was wrong. The skin was smooth, like it had been stretched too tight over the bones. The eyes were too big, too round, reflecting the fire like glass marbles. And the mouth, when it curled into a grin, I swear it had too many teeth. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing just stood there, staring at me with my own face, smiling like it was in on some joke I didn't understand. And then it took a step forward. Something broke loose in my chest, and I turned and bolted for my tent. I dove inside, zipped it up, and grabbed my hunting knife. My breath was ragged, my pulse a wild, stuttering thing in my throat. Outside, I heard it circling the tent. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. It wasn't leaving. And then, hello, my own voice, right outside the tent. I clenched the knife, so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't answer. It circled again, another lap around the tent, then another. The fire outside had burned low, and the shadows stretched long. I watched them flicker against the tent fabric, waiting for the moment when one of them would bend at the wrong angle, stretch too tall, become something that wasn't quite human. And then the whisper came, right next to the thin fabric of my tent. "Let me in." It was my voice, but wrong. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth would crack. It whispered again, "I just want to come in." I squeezed my eyes shut. I told myself I was imagining it, that the wind was playing tricks on me, that I was dreaming, but I wasn't, because I could hear it breathing. The slow, rhythmic inhale, the long, hissing exhale. right outside my tent. I stayed frozen like that for hours. At some point, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes again, the first light of dawn was creeping through the trees. And it was gone. The only proof it had been there were the footprints in the dirt, circling my tent over and over and over. The strangest part? They were identical to mine. I didn't waste time. I stuffed my gear into my pack and got the hell out of there, practically running back to my truck. The entire drive home, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see my own face grinning at me from the back seat. I still don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear footsteps, just a little too slow, and I pray it hasn't found me again. Story 2. Last fall, I went camping with 3 of my friends, Jake, Mark, and Lewis, near an old logging trail deep in the woods. The kind of place where the trees lean in a little too close, where the air is thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. We hiked all day, found a perfect spot near a quiet lake, and set up camp. By nightfall, we had a fire going, some beers cracked open, and the kind of easy, lazy conversation that only happens when you're out in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, no deadlines, no distractions. No one else was around, or so we thought. Around midnight, Mark was the first to notice it. "Hey," he said, squinting past the firelight. "Was that tent always there?" We turned. About 30 yards away, just beyond the tree line, stood a tent. A single, old-looking tent. Dark canvas, weather-worn, a torn flap hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. I frowned. No way. We would have seen that earlier. "We hiked in from that direction," Lewis added. "That wasn't there before." We stared at it for a long moment, the fire crackling between us. The more I looked at it, the more something about it made my skin crawl. It was too still, too silent. No movement inside, no light, no gear scattered outside like you'd expect from a normal campsite. Just a black hole sitting at the edge of the woods. "Maybe someone set it up while we weren't looking," Mark said. "Maybe they're sleeping." Jake shook his head. "I don't like it." None of us did. But being the idiots we were, we decided to check it out. We grabbed our flashlights and walked toward it, one cautious step at a time. The closer we got, the more the air around us seemed to change. The smell hit us first. A thick, rancid stench, like rotting meat mixed with something sour. The kind of smell that makes your throat tighten, makes your stomach flip. "Jesus," Lewis muttered, covering his nose. My gut told me to turn back. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get the hell away from that tent. But then Jake, because of course it was Jake, stepped forward and peeked inside. A split second later, he screamed. I grabbed him by the arm and yanked him back. He was shaking, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a fish struggling for air. "What the hell, man?" I demanded. "What did you see?" Jake didn't answer. Not right away. We practically dragged him back to the fire, where he sat down hard on the cold dirt. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold his flashlight. Finally, in a voice so small I barely heard him, he whispered, "That wasn't empty. That wasn't empty." We all went dead silent. Mark swallowed. "What do you mean?" Jake lifted his head slowly, eyes dark, distant, like he was still seeing whatever the hell was in that tent. And then he said, There was someone sitting in there. Goosebumps rippled over my arms. Mark let out a nervous laugh. Okay, so what? Maybe it's just some camper. Jake shook his head violently. No, you don't get it. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. And they didn't have a face. The words hit like a sledgehammer to the gut. What? I said. Jake's hands clenched into fists. His voice was hoarse, ragged. There was no face. Just skin, like it was smooth, stretched over where the eyes, nose, mouth should have been. Just nothing. Nobody spoke after that. Nobody laughed. Because whatever was inside that tent wasn't human. For the rest of the night, we sat around the fire, eyes darting toward the trees, jumping at every rustle, every snap of a twig. We didn't sleep. None of us even dared to go inside our own tents. And the worst part, we kept hearing something moving. Not close, not right up against us, but in the distance beyond the trees. Slow, deliberate footsteps. A dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the ground. Every time we shined a flashlight into the darkness, there was nothing there. At first light, we made a pact. We had to go back, had to check, had to prove to ourselves that Jake had just imagined it, that we were all just tired, spooked, paranoid. We walked back to where the tent had been. It was gone, not packed up, not moved, gone. The dirt where it had stood was undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there at all. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Jake looked pale, sweaty. This isn't real. This didn't happen. But it did. None of us talk about it anymore. Not really. We went back to our normal lives, pretending it was just some weird, unexplainable thing that didn't matter. But sometimes when I'm in the woods alone, I get this feeling, like there's a tent just behind me, waiting, and I never look back. Story 3. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I like scary stories, the kind you tell around a campfire to see who jumps first. But I was always the skeptic, the one who needed proof. And if there was one thing I learned that night in the woods, it was this: proof finds you whether you want it or not. It was late September when Emily and I decided to go camping. We were both burned out from work, sick of the city noise, and craving some quiet. The kind of quiet you can only get in the deep woods, where the air smells like pine needles and the only light at night comes from the stars. We picked a spot miles from the nearest town, near an old fire lookout tower that hadn't been used in decades. I had read about it online, built in the 1950s, abandoned sometime in the 80s, now just a skeleton of rusted metal and rotting wood. The pictures made it look eerie, but that's what drew me in. There's something about forgotten places that feels like a challenge, like a secret waiting to be discovered. Emily wasn't as thrilled. She liked camping, but she liked it with a bathroom and a cabin, not a tent in the middle of nowhere next to a creepy tower. But she went along with it because she loved me. That's something I remind myself of often. We set up camp in a clearing about 50 yards from the tower, close enough that we could see its silhouette against the sky when the sun went down. It was taller than I expected, maybe 50 feet high, with a wraparound deck and a hatch at the top that was padlocked shut. I remember looking up at it, feeling watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. The night was cold, colder than it should have been for late September. The wind barely moved the trees, and the silence was thick, pressing. We had a small fire going, enough to keep the dark from feeling too close. We ate, talked, laughed a little. Emily even started to relax. Then, at around 2 a.m., we heard the first knock. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart hammering. Emily grabbed my arm. What the hell was that? I listened. At first, I thought it might be an animal brushing against a tree, but the sound was too distinct, too human, and it was coming from the tower. I turned my flashlight toward it. The beam cut through the darkness, but nothing moved. The tower stood there, still and lifeless, but something about it felt wrong. Probably just the wind, I said, but even I didn't believe that. A few minutes passed. Silence settled again. Just when Emily started to relax, it happened again. Thump, thump, thump. Same pattern, same slow, deliberate rhythm. Something inside me needed to know. I stood up. I'm checking it out. Emily's hand tightened around my wrist. Don't, please. I hesitated. She looked scared, more scared than I'd ever seen her. But curiosity is a nasty thing. It digs into you, won't let go. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the tower. Every step felt like I was getting further from safety, like something in the dark was waiting for me to come just a little closer. When I reached the base, I stood there for a moment, staring up at the platform above. The metal staircase groaned in the wind. The padlocked hatch was barely visible in the dark. I don't know what made me do it, but I lifted my fist and knocked. 3 times. Thump, thump, thump. The sound echoed up the tower, swallowed by the night. Silence. And then, thump, thump, thump. It knocked back. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. My brain scrambled for logic. A bird? A loose piece of what's shifting in the wind? But deep down, I knew there was something inside that tower, and it had just answered me. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. Emily saw my face, grabbed my hand, and we dove into the tent, zipping it up like that flimsy layer of fabric could protect us. We sat there, clutching each other, waiting for whatever was in the tower to make its next move. But the knocks never came again. The night stretched on, suffocating. Every creak of the trees made my skin crawl. I don't think either of us slept. When the first light of dawn hit, I made a decision. I needed to know. Emily begged me not to, but I was already walking toward the tower, hands shaking. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. When I reached the hatch, I saw the rusted padlock hanging there, untouched. No way in, no way out, but something had been in there. I pulled out my pocket knife, jammed it into the lock, and snapped it open. The hatch creaked as I pushed it upward, my breath catching in my throat. Inside was nothing but dust, except for one thing, a chair sitting dead center in the middle of the room, and on the wooden floor, where no one had stepped for decades, were 3 fresh handprints. I left the woods that day with more questions than answers. I don't camp anymore, and if I ever hear knocking in the middle of the night again, I won't answer.